Welcome, everyone. My name is Jason Merchant. I have the honor of being the moderator at tonight's event and to welcome all of you to the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality and Mobility's event tonight on merit and privilege, test scores and college admissions, where we have a very distinguished panel who will be talking about this issue, particularly around a new book written by Nicholas Leman, who joins us from Columbia University. So I'll take a moment to introduce our panelists and tell you a little bit about the format for the event, and then we'll let them take over. So Nicholas Leman is has had a distinguished career as a journalist and author of many books, including two on tonight's topic, The Big Test, which he published in 1999, and a more recent one that I left here called Higher Admissions, The Rise, Decline, and Return of Standardized Testing. He joined academia in 2003 as the dean of the Columbia University's School of Journalism, where he spent more than a decade and then joined the faculty there. And we're looking very much forward to hearing his brief version of this book. I'll invite him to the podium to give remarks, and then we will have responses from three panelists who are on our faculty here at the University of Chicago. We'll start with Lesley Turner, who is an associate professor here at the Harris School, and then turn to Steve Raudenbush, who is Lewis Sebring Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Sociology and at Harris, and then turn the mic over to Stephen Durlauf, who is the Frank B. Hickson Distinguished Service Professor and Director of the Stone Center. So I will say only a few words. This is a very important topic. This is how we do admissions, not just to college, but also to graduate school. So everyone in this room presumably has taken one or more of these standardized tests. Universities, including selective ones like this one, are in a special moment, a moment of crisis, in the word of our president recently. We have suffered a reputational fall in the past decade that is unprecedented, with only 36% of Americans having a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in us, down from almost 60% just in 2015. 68% of US adults say that higher education, quote, is headed in the wrong direction. Part of the reason for this, many analysts think, is our universal adoption of racial preferences or favoritism in admissions and financial aid. In particular, the preference shown for Black and Hispanic students over white and Asian ones, and for whites over Asians. When asked directly about racial preferences in selective college admissions, only 17% of Americans, according to the Pew 2023 survey, supported them, and 82% of Americans were against them. Against them were also large majorities of Hispanics, Blacks, and Asians, and of Democratic voters in California, where the question has been on the ballot twice, once in 1996 and again in 2020. In 2020, where Biden in California received 63% of the vote, only 42% of those same California voters supported Proposition 16, which was a ballot measure that asked whether California should be allowed to use race in college admissions, state employment, and state contracting. In other words, the use of racial preferences in college admissions is very unpopular in the United States. It is not very unpopular among the people who work at universities, as we will undoubtedly learn, right? Admissions matters. It matters not just to the people who end up at selective universities, but it matters to their families, and it matters to the public. For lots of reasons that I hope our panelists will go into. Although we do not have polling on this, most Americans are likely to believe that college admissions should be based solely on merit or capacity to succeed in college, and that standardized tests such as the SAT are good measures of such capacity. To say that this common belief among students and parents is not shared by many of the experts and commentariat is an understatement. So, I will invite Nick Leman to the podium to give us his thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks for having me here. This is a real treat. It's a big challenge to boil down like 10 or 12 years of your life into 15 minutes. So I'm going to try, but know that there's everything I say, there's a lot more behind it. And I'm going to waste 30 seconds or something of the 15 minutes by telling you that it came back to me when I walked into the building. I actually interviewed Irving Harris for the big test. The namesake of this school. Why? Because back in the 1950s, standardized tests for education were sort of like social media. It was a gold rush. Everybody was going to go into it and get rich. And Mr. Harris, who had made his fortune in the cosmetics industry, decided he was going to get into the standardized testing industry and bought a company called SRA, and had a competitor test to the SAT. And he was a fierce competitor of Educational Testing Service, which you all know. At ETS won, he lost. He wound up selling his company very cheap to IBM, and then it went out of business. So there is a standardized testing connection here. I want to say a little just about what's going on right now, but also at least hint at the many larger and more profound issues that testing kind of gets you into. So what's going on right now is several things. And some of this is since the book Higher Admissions came out only a few months ago. COVID happened. During COVID, many universities that required standardized tests for admissions went test optional. And the stated reason for that was because of administration difficulties having to do with COVID. I strongly suspect that some of the reason also was these universities were essentially waiting for a Supreme Court decision that came down in the summer of 2023, SFFA versus Harvard, and then there was also a North Carolina case. This case was maybe the final nail in the coffin as far as the Supreme Court is concerned of using race as a preference in college admissions. There have been, I may be the only person in the world who has covered every single Supreme Court case that has to do with affirmative action, going back to DeFunis v. Odegaard back in the early 70s when I was a college student. So just take it from me, there's been a lot of these cases over a lot of years with a lot of 5-4 decisions. And then finally, the Supreme Court went in the other direction and said no racial preferences. After that, and after COVID, a number of prominent schools went back to mandatory SAT. So that's kind of where things are now. MIT, Harvard, Yale, et cetera, all went back to mandatory SAT, and others like University of Chicago and Columbia have not gone back to mandatory SAT. So that's kind of where things stand now. We're in the middle of a big national decision about whether to have mandatory SAT, ACT, et cetera, as part of the admissions process. Context. There's something like 2,300 colleges and universities in the US that grant a bachelor's degree. 50, maybe, depending on how you count, are highly selective. Many more than 50 have required tests. Many more have either gone or remained test optional than have gone back to test required. So understand that this is an argument about a handful of super elite schools and how they do their admissions and what is the role of testing in their admissions. that doesn't mean the stakes are small, because these schools matter a lot. They take up a lot of national mind share, and how they handle tests does affect the composition of their class. Example that's close at hand being MIT. After the Supreme Court decision, the latest class they accepted, I think, was 5% black, after they had previously, pre-decision, been about 15% black. So those kinds of results often happen when going to test mandatory. Why is that? It's because, although I'm making a very long story shorter than it needs to be, testing is the evidence in court challenges to affirmative action programs. The typical case, not all, is a white person says, I was more qualified than a minority who got in, I was rejected. The proof that I was more qualified is my test scores. So by going back to test required in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, you're putting yourself at risk of these kinds of lawsuits, or you're actually not considering race as a plus factor. Let me go to some of the larger themes here, and I'm only going to be able to touch on them very briefly, but I'll tell you, Lesley was asking me how I got into this, so I'll tell you how I got into it, just as a sort of marker. I did an earlier book on the Great Black Migration. The principal settings were Mississippi and Chicago. So I spent a lot of time in Chicago when I was working on that book, and including at the University of Chicago. And the characters in the book, the people who had made the migration were, had ended up in a variety of places, but some of them had ended up in a notorious Chicago institution that no longer exists, but some of you will have heard of it or remember it, the Robert Taylor Homes. That was the world's largest public housing project that ran not too far from here along the Dan Ryan Expressway, kind of along the south side. So I was spending a lot of time there, and I would, especially visiting one family, and it was, what struck me was you'd be in the Robert Taylor Homes, and you'd be looking out the window. The Chicago L was right outside. Dan Ryan was right outside. You could see the Loop buildings outside the window a couple miles away. And the Loop felt a million miles away. It felt like you couldn't possibly get there from the Robert Taylor Homes. And I started saying to myself, why is it that someplace that's geographically so close can feel so psychologically and sociologically and economically distant? Somewhere in there, I went to see the late, great Columbia sociologist Robert Merton, and I was sort of spilling all this out to him and saying, what am I looking for here? And he said, you want to write about opportunity structure. There's this thing called opportunity structure. I had never heard of it because I wasn't a sociology major, but it exists, as we all know. And you need to find a way to talk about opportunity structure in America. So I then thought the way that appeared to me as a sort of opportunity structure moment that felt palpable was sitting down as a high school kid and taking these tests, because you felt like you were sitting down for a few hours and they were going to send you to your destiny. So I wrote a letter to Educational Testing Service. I found out that their founding president had been Henry Chauncey. So I said, I'd like to request access to Henry Chauncey's papers in your archives. And in truth, I didn't know if there were any papers, and I didn't know if there were any archives, so it was kind of like a shot in the dark. But they wrote back and said, yes, we have decided to grant your requests. And it turned out there were voluminous papers, and you could sort of trace the whole story of how this system was set up. And again, there are these sort of narrower questions about how should tests be used in admissions, but the more I got into it, the more I realized there were much larger questions. Where to begin? First of all, the key figure in this was James Bryant Conant, at least in my view, who was the president of Harvard in the 1930s and 40s, very influential. Henry Chauncey began as an assistant dean working for him. Together, they devised the use of SATs, which were descended from the early IQ tests, to be used as a way of finding what people now call colloquially diamonds in the rough. Students from modest backgrounds who hadn't gone to fancy private schools but had great intellectual potential, and they could be brought to Ivy League colleges on scholarship. So I don't have time to do much but highlight a couple of ideas, so I'll do that a little bit and hope we can get back into it. There's, I'd say, three ways you can think about this. One, which we just heard, and I don't even know if you knew you were landing where you were landing in preference to other places, was what this system is a way of handing out a reward, which is this incredible opportunity of going to an elite university and all the education, all the things it leads to, and you know, that reward must be given to the people who most deserve it. And it would be most heartwarming if the reward went to people from, you know, modest backgrounds who are being given a big chance because they worked hard and they were smart and so on. So that's one frame. A second frame is, no, these decisions are a way for the university itself to sort of curate who's here. We want to have a certain kind of student body with many kinds of diversity and many kinds of ability, and it should be on us, the university, to make these decisions. We're not handing out a reward. We're running our own institution by our preferences. And that's, you know, in track with what had been the dominant theory of affirmative action legally, the diversity argument. And then the third would be universities are, in effect, selecting at least part of a leadership cadre for the nation, and so therefore they should make selections based, at least in part, on what they want the nation's leadership class to look like in a generation. I think the third reason is the main reason for affirmative action. That is, these selective universities were strikingly non-integrated at a time when the civil rights movement was peaking, and they made a conscious decision to integrate themselves racially. They did it up to a point, but significantly. It worked. It did help change the way the leadership cadre of America looks, but doing that was in conflict with this first rationale that it's a reward to the most deserving, no matter what other factors. Let me say one other thing quickly, and then we can get into other things later, which is a comment on the title of this session, Merit or Privilege. One of the problematic things about this whole system is you could also title this session Merit and Privilege. That is, the people in general who get higher test scores are also highly correlated with the people who come from more affluent, more educated families, et cetera. It's possible to argue, and some people do, that there was a kind of one generation resorting, but now, you know, you guys are going to have kids, I predict, who rank high on, quote, merit. So, you know, one final thing to talk about, and there's a longer story here, but think about, why does the word meritocracy exist? It was invented by a person named Michael Young, a British sociologist, no longer with us, but I did also get to interview him for the big test. And what he pointed out was that if I say to you guys the word aristocracy, what does that mean to you? It means, oh, that's the opposite of meritocracy. It's society run by inheritance, by an elite that just passes everything on to its children. And Conan thought he was breaking up an aristocracy. What Michael Young said was aristocracy and meritocracy mean the same thing. So I just grafted a Latin prefix onto a Greek suffix because the word aristocracy had been corrupted. And the big question to ask about the meritocracy is, as we understand meritocracy, how meritocratic is it really? Or how much is it becoming more, or has it become more aristocratic? Much to talk about here, but that's just a light skate across the surface, and thanks for having me.
Well, there we go. This is really a pleasure to discuss this book. It is on a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I teach a class here on higher education policy, and we spend a whole week talking about access and admissions to elite institutions and what is the role for different factors, and how, if our objective is to make these elite universities look a little bit more like the US population in terms of socioeconomic status and race, what is the best way to achieve that? And so now I have another resource to give to students who are interested in this particular topic. But I want to take a step back and think about this topic from a very high level, 10,000-foot view. And I think when we talk about the role of admissions tests in access to college, we're really thinking about how colleges should organize their admission systems. And at least where I sit as an economist, I think this depends fundamentally on what we as society think the goals of higher education should be. And I think some of these came out in the comments. So is it that students should be matched to institutions that would benefit them the most, that would produce the greatest private benefits? So if a student is more likely to graduate from Harvard if they come from a high-income background than a student from a low-income background, then that's a good thing. Another alternative would be to match students with schools to produce the greatest social benefits. So to improve social mobility. This might not be the same as sort of maximizing private benefits. Or we think there's sort of broad externalities from having a diverse student body in elite institutions or higher education levels overall. And then finally, I think as we, in the US, retreat from race-based affirmative action, there is sort of a loss of a tool that was seen as being able to mitigate inequities due to historic and current systemic racism. Okay. And then the final question when we're thinking about affirmative action or the use of college admissions exams is sort of, how do elite institutions fit into this framework? Okay, so this is sort of a very small slice of higher education. Only about 6% of students attend selective institutions, so institutions that admit 25% or fewer of their applicants. And less than 1% attend what are called Ivy Plus, and UChicago fits into this category. And then sort of, I've raised a lot of questions here, not answers, but assuming we as society come to agreement on what the role or the goals of higher education should be, the next question is, what are the admissions policies to best achieve these goals? Okay. And we can think about sort of a first best world with no restrictions, where all of the tools are available if schools want them, versus where we are today in a constrained world where schools are not legally allowed to take into account race explicitly in their admissions decisions. And then the final question that I think this book is sort of very interested in is, how do college admissions exams fit into this picture? How much weight should be put on college admissions exams versus other factors? And how predictive are college admissions exams for student success? And on one hand, this matters for schools because how many of their students graduate matters for their reputation, but it also matters for these broader goals because the lion's share of benefits of higher education accrue to those who complete, who make it across the finish line. And so matching students to schools where they're unlikely to be successful is not necessarily benefiting students or these broader goals. Okay, so focusing in on this last question, what is the role of admissions, standardized tests in college admissions? There's sort of three broad policies that exist in the US higher education ecosystem. Schools that require students to take these admissions exams. That's sort of what we think of as the traditional use of SAT and ACT. Schools that are test optional, and this became sort of a more prevalent policy starting in the 2010s, initially adopted among fairly selective liberal arts colleges, although the adoption sort of accrued to a broader set of institutions as we approached COVID. And then COVID, of course, there was a big shift for many reasons. And then the final set of policies are test blind. So in test optional, students get to choose, do I submit my standardized test scores or do I let the school see my standardized test scores? And so schools have a set of applicants where some are submitting these scores and some aren't. Okay. This leads to some potentially interesting patterns that I'll talk about in terms of who gets admitted and who applies. Test blind, on the other hand, is when schools say, I don't care if you've taken the SAT or ACT, I will not take that into account. I'm not going to look at your scores. And this is actually much less common, although in the past few years, it's been adopted by the UC system and the Cal State system in California, but sort of a pretty recent policy among schools that practice selective admissions. Okay. And what I want you to have in mind when we're thinking about, is this a good thing? Are these test optional, test blind policies benefiting the US, society, or students, if we think about those goals? I think we fundamentally have to take into account the counterfactual. So if SAT and ACT scores are not available, what information is available for schools to make these decisions? And is this information that is going to have sort of less bias than SAT and ACT scores, where we know there are gaps in performance in terms of socioeconomic status and race and ethnicity? Well, when we think about these other factors, a key one is grades in high school, which is at face value sort of pretty uniform. High-performing students get high grades, lower-performing students don't. But this is only one factor and is somewhat dependent on what courses students take or even what they have access to. So looking at Lesley Turner coming from Ypsilanti Public High School, where there were no AP tests, but there was an SAT test when I was applying to college, there was less of a potential penalty from the fact that my transcripts didn't show AP biology, AP chemistry, AP calculus, so on and so forth, because there was this other factor. And I think the other thing that we might be concerned about are sort of extracurricular activities. So unpaid internships, sports, leadership positions, where students from more low-income or disadvantaged backgrounds may not have time to pursue these activities because they have to work while they're in school. Okay. And then we should think about how the use of admissions exams affects the matching of students to schools, both through student self-selection into where they apply and through who colleges admit conditional on that application pool. Okay. So what do we know from social science about the effects of these various policies? We have the most evidence on test optional policies because, as I mentioned, they've been around for a while and their use has been growing over time. And I think in contrast to sort of the conventional wisdom, the early evidence from the take-up of test optional policies suggests this isn't really moving the needle in terms of the composition of students who are attending these sort of elite liberal arts schools at first, and then sort of a broader set of liberal arts and universities. On the other hand, these policies do seem to benefit schools because more students apply. There's less of a barrier, right, if you don't have to take the test. And the students who reveal their SAT scores tend to select into that, and they have higher scores. Both of these things, SAT scores of admitted students and sort of the number of students applying, which feeds into the admissions rate, factor into the typical rankings like US News and World Report. And so there's a benefit to schools in terms of their national rankings, even if it's not changing the composition of students, okay? And so sort of why do we see an increase in applications but no sort of shift in the composition of students? Well, there's sort of an offsetting effect where there's a lower barrier to applying, but there's also a perceived increase in the selectivity through sort of these channels of increased applications and higher SAT scores. And then there's also scope for strategic behavior on the part of students in terms of who submits their scores and who doesn't. And more advantaged applicants are better able to decide, will it benefit me to submit this score? Test blind admissions, as I mentioned, we don't really have a lot of empirical evidence because it's so new. The final thing I will say with my 0 minutes left is that there's a separate set of policies that states have adopted that might be relevant here. Okay, and these are state-level universal college entrance exam policies where students in high school, as a requirement, have to take the SAT or ACT. And this lowers the barrier to taking these tests because they are done in the high school versus students have to drive somewhere to access the test. And the evidence shows that this actually does increase applications and enrollment in four-year institutions for students who are unlikely, they look like they're unlikely to take these tests, but would be admitted to selective institutions. So I look forward to the discussion and having a conversation about this interesting book. Me.
Count this against me, all right? Well, I want to thank Stephen Durlauf and the Stone Center for having this really important discussion. I want to thank Nick Leman for writing a really wonderful book. It's amazing how accurately, I've studied this a little bit, he covers a really complicated history of this controversy and uses that to frame the question about these policy issues that we now face. I strongly recommend it. So in my remarks, I'm going to focus on three propositions. The first is that universities do have a compelling interest in recruiting a racially and ethnically diverse student body. Often said, I think it needs to be said now, I need to say it. The second one is that we need admissions tests. I don't believe in the test optional framework, but we don't need the SAT or its cousins, the law school aptitude test, the GRE, and others. And third, until we solve the connection between the K-12 curriculum and the admissions tests, education in the United States will continue to perform badly, relevant to most of the advanced nations in the world. So that's a kind of a strong statement, I guess. On diversity. So my ideas about diversity are grounded in part on my experience as the statistician in the University of Michigan's 2003 law school and undergraduate affirmative action case, which was a successful defense of affirmative action. Our strategy was to pose a causal question. What would happen to the racial ethnic composition of various contexts in which students learn? So for example, if you're in the undergraduate school, there's a freshman seminar. 19 students. I guess maybe some of you probably know why it's 19, because U.S. News and World Report gives you credit if it's less than 20. So every student, every school has one of these. But what would be the racial and ethnic composition in that setting under two policies? The current policy where there is affirmative action, and the alternative where affirmative action would be abolished. Other settings could include a dorm hall. That might involve 50 people. In the law school case, it might involve the moot court, which is a very important legal training. And so based on the analysis of 5 years of admissions data, we estimated the probability in each in each of those environments in which the environment would include 0, 1, 2, or more underrepresented minority students under these two policies. The results were dramatic. We found that if affirmative action were abolished, a white student, for example, would experience the dramatic increase in the probability of attending a freshman seminar with no black students. The probability that a black student would find him or herself to be the only black student in such a setting would increase dramatically. Social psychology comes into play. Being a minority of one will tend to suppress participation. In a minority of two, there's a tendency for the two people of the same identity who are in the minority to stick together. If you have a minority of 3 or more, it opens up the possibility of hearing diverse views from that group and really sort of, I would say, advancing the discourse. So now let's think about the following question. Is understanding slavery and Jim Crow central to an understanding of the history of our republic, its constitution, its politics, and its society? Suppose this is the topic of a freshman seminar. I know it's difficult to talk about race in America, but does it make sense to make that conversation easier by excluding black students from the conversation? So in sociology, interactions between social networks matter. At least since Marvin Granovetter, this is virtually a theorem. His AJS, American Journal of Sociology article, 1973, 75,000 citations. People like yourself tend to know what you know. If you want to learn, walk over a bridge to other social networks. A closely related article by our own James Coleman introduced the concept of social capital, a set of social connections that is essential to the production of human capital. American Journal of Sociology, 1988, 70,000 citations. Coleman's insights emerged from the Rational Choice Workshop at Chicago, including Coleman and Gary Becker, who was also, by the way, a member of our department, the sociology department. There's good reason to believe that constructing an ethnically diverse student body is a compelling interest of the university. As a side note, I want to add, and this is a little bit seemingly contradictory, that although discontinuing affirmative action would be expected to and did have a dramatic effect on the composition of the student body, such a decision would have very little effect on the probability of admission of a white student. So you statisticians out there think about how that could happen, how a dramatic result could occur with very little effect on the probability of admission. Okay, I won't give you the answer. You think of it. So now the next thing I want to talk about is what is the SAT? So and what has it become? But a large number, it turns out, of applicants to the law school during our case had paid for coaching on the law school aptitude test. And coaching is pretty expensive. If coaching is effective and not cheap, then admissions decisions would be biased by students' ability to pay. Does coaching help on these sort of so-called aptitude tests? So here's an interesting story. In the 1970s, the Kaplan Coaching School claimed that it could dramatically increase your SAT score and if you were willing to pay. And this assertion posed a mortal threat to the business model of the Education Testing Service, which sells the SAT. So what would any self-respecting corporation do? In this case, you tell me. Sue. And what would Kaplan do in response? Well, they claimed that SAT said that Kaplan was engaging in false advertising because they said you can't change the SAT because it measures aptitude, as if aptitude is a fixed aspect of the human organism. And Kaplan made the argument, you are guilty of false advertising because we can change the SAT, and it's not the aptitude measure that you thought it was. So the FTC did something which I guess you could say is, they said, we're going to do some serious research on this. As, I guess that's the kind of thing a government agency do back in the days when America was great. Or not really great, just better than it is now. It turns out that the FTC study came under some methodological criticism, and what followed was a whole flock of randomized trials, more randomized trials than we'd ever had in education before. And the results were quite clear that the SAT could be affected. The effect size is in the range of in math, 20% of a standard deviation. All right. So what happened, one of the things that happened was that SAT renamed its test. It was no longer the Scholastic Aptitude Test. It was just the SAT. They actually didn't rename it, they denamed it. So one of the questions that I want to ask is based on a very highly technical psychometric analysis requiring deep applications of mathematics is, if you can't define what your test measures, should we use it? Well, a lot of people still think that SAT measures aptitude. It's a bad thing. If you think that that it measures something invariant, then there's no incentive for you to work hard. If I'm having trouble, well, it's because I'm stupid. And SAT has proven that. There's no reason for me to work very hard. Well, this is not the way it's done in a lot of other nations. The nations that are beating the hell out of us in mathematics and other subjects, where they have a national curriculum, people are trained to teach the national curriculum, the admissions test is based on the national curriculum, and people work very hard to try to learn the national curriculum. Those are the countries that are doing really well, okay? So let me just, I've got a few more things. This goes back, some of you know Carol Dweck and the growth mindset research, very powerful. If you believe that you can expand your intelligence through effort, when you get negative feedback, you intensify your effort. We've set up an incentive system for people to not think that way. And this, Harold Stevenson at Michigan did many experiments and compared East Asian and American studies on these, with respect to growth mindset. So let me finish in the 0 minutes, as Lesley was saying, that I have, and make 3 conclusions. The first is, I think making tests optional is a bad idea. Essentially what happens, and I've seen it happen in our own department, if the student doesn't give you the test score, you infer they have a low test score. So that's not going to help. Having no test score makes no sense, particularly in selective schools, because in a selective school, everybody has high grades. So you need some other information to make some decisions, and it's hopefully fair. But my argument is, you don't need the SAT. Notwithstanding the difficulty we've had with the Common Core curriculum, which is mentioned in Nick's book, which is an attempt to create a curriculum and a set of admissions tests that are connected. We really have to solve that problem. This is my key point. And I think if we don't solve that problem, the nation as a whole is going to continue to have mediocre at best results. I want to say one other thing. How would we create diversity? Different schools are capable of teaching different things. In a poor school, you're not going to have the opportunity to learn as much as you are in a much more advanced school. So one way to create or sustain diversity is to give people credit, people in low SES schools, for learning what they're able to learn, for working hard and getting to the top of their distribution. That we know would increase diversity. So that's another way we can go. And my time is up. Thank you.
So let me first thank all of you for participating, and Nick, wonderful to have a chance to meet you and to discuss this important book. What I want to do in my comments is three things. First of all, I want to say something about the appropriate rules, the objectives for college admissions. Second, discuss the informational content of standardized tests, and third, talk about meritocracy. So in terms of college admissions and objectives, I want to put on the table that in thinking about whether schools should have the SAT, should they have test optional, et cetera, that it's important to think about an ecology of schools. In other words, it's not about the University of Chicago in isolation versus a community college in isolation, but the entire ecosystem that is producing educational outcomes and creating opportunities for people. And the reason I emphasize that, and I think that Nick's book talks about this, is that the excessive focus on elite institutions sometimes clouds the way that these debates go. And so if we take California, where I grew up, as an example, community colleges essentially have open admissions. If you have a high school diploma or the equivalent, you were admitted to a junior college system. Caltech, of course, is quite different. There, the ACT or the SAT is mandatory. Interestingly, if you look at the University of California, Berkeley, they are now test unknown. In other words, no information from tests are going to be used there. The reason I give these as examples is would make an argument, I'm not sure about Berkeley, but the other ones I think are quite appropriate. The objective of the community college system is to create opportunities independent of what you've done in high school, et cetera. And this becomes a beltway for individuals from every possible socioeconomic configuration. Caltech has a different objective in mind, which is producing frontier scientists. Systems like the University of California system, which have decided to go no test, there it's more complicated, and that's why it's not so obvious to me why that's the appropriate policy. But the objective, in other words, I think in talking about colleges has to be, and their rules, has to be matched to how we think about this plethora of objectives. And as has already been discussed, there really are a number of them that make sense, and I think they're all perfectly defensible. One is growth of the knowledge frontier. It matters for societies that scientific advances are made. It matters for societies that deeper understandings of history are made, and all of those are necessarily going to have something to do with who we're matching between the types of students and the types of professors. A second example is simply human capital creation. In other words, we want a population that has high skills and therefore can compete internationally and have high per capita GDP and the usual desirable outcomes. That is a distinct objective. That also makes you think about the value added of college, not just the backwards idea that whoever has the highest test score is necessarily admitted. A third example, which is of course fundamental, is producing citizens. It's not just a matter where we're producing members of a labor force. We are producing people that have to make decisions and have to understand the collective history and culture of the United States. That leads to different rules, et cetera. And finally, opportunity enhancement. In other words, that the educational institutions we have and the rules we have for them help define the ways in which inequalities in family background and the like are going to be rectified. And so the upshot, in my judgment, is that we really do need to think about multiple objectives and tailoring rules and admissions associated with those objectives, and there's no reason that different universities should have the same rules. Comment number two, what is being revealed by test scores? First of all, one has to be clear, we don't really know very much about this, and the reason is for basic statistical problems associated with this study, and that is the problem of self-selection. Students make choices. They self-select to apply to this school or this school. And when we have evidence of the undermatch hypothesis that very high test score students aren't applying to certain institutions or local institutions, that says that the observations we have on school performance and test scores are going to have to control for that. There's a second issue. The schools are making choices about admissions and who they're going to let in. And the third is students are going to make the choices as to which acceptances they're going to make versus those that they decline. And to give you an example of the power of this, if somebody told me that there was a PhD student at MIT whose SAT in high school was 500 in mathematics, what would I call them? I would call them a genius. And the reason for that is you know that the school was making a decision based on information outside the test scores, and they presumably proved a theorem or something like that. But the serious point, of course, is that when we look at these data that are relating test scores to outcomes, we have to account for the fact there's all this self-selection going on, and these correlations may not be interpretable. So that's a fundamental limit, and that's why you see studies that try to look at people going off wait lists, et cetera, and that's a somewhat delimited area. The second thing to say, and again echoing the book, is that most of the studies of the effects, the relationship between SAT and outcomes has to do with grades, and average grades in particular. It's far from obvious that that is really the objective of an institution in any sense. After all, the four that I gave you, none of them really map very closely to grades, do they? The one exception for this is a paper by, that I identify here. And what I want to say is that what turns out to be predictable beyond average grades is access to the upper tails of things. So in other words, SATs are predictive not beyond first-year grades to things such as the ability to end up in an elite law school, ending up in an elite law firm, et cetera. And so I put on the table that the best evidence we have that is mapping SATs, standardized tests, to things that are fundamental outside within school performance. Obviously, graduation matters, and we think grades have some information about what we learn. It may be very delimited. That speaks to me to the scientific frontier. In other words, that what SATs may be effective, the standardized tests are effective at, is helping identify the real outliers in terms of their potential to push the scientific frontier. They're not going to be very good, in other words, for the other criteria. And so once again, got to think very hard about the multiplicity of the criteria and the informational content. Final thing I want to say is the following, and that is, in my judgment, meritocracy has been ceded to a certain definition of meritocracy, and that shouldn't have been done. In fact, I want to argue that meritocracy and merit, in fact, are a complex notion. Now, to be clear, Amartya Sen wrote about this in a book I edited, actually, 25 years ago, in which he pointed out that merit is actually underdetermined when we talk about it. In other words, merit for what? I could have moral merit, the argument that people, for example, that were in the who serve their country in the military, they have moral merit that makes a claim for a college admission. A different type of merit could say that the value added that somebody adds to the institution is going to be calculated, so on and so forth. And so in other words, whenever we talk about merit and meritocracy, we have to be careful about the definitions. Now, my view on this is the following, and this is what I've written about. I actually advocate meritocracy, but I advocate what I call prospective meritocracy. Retrospective meritocracy treats college admissions as a reward. You have high grades, you have high test scores, that gives you an automatic claim to something. A different idea would be to say that we define meritocracy functionally in the sense that we have an institution that has objectives, and conditional on the objectives, the person who merits the admissions, or the individuals that merit the admissions, are the ones that contribute to it. Nobody would say that my CV gives me a claim to a job in the business sector. You and I'd be terrible at it. And the point is, even if I have lots of things listed on it, that tells us nothing. So the idea of meritocracy as a reward has very limited purchase. So why do I push this idea that meritocracy that is prospective is essential in both defining meritocracy and giving a proper role for test scores in the admissions process? The first point is simple, and that is there is no reason from the perspective of prospective meritocracy to think there should be some monotonic relationship between test scores and the probability of admissions. It's very easy to see why that would be true. I might say, for example, that my goal in admitting somebody is asking what the value added is of attending the institution. Value added could easily be higher for people that didn't have 23 advanced placement tests when they were in high school, as opposed to those that didn't. And so once one actually describes the specific environments in which we're thinking about these objectives that I've described, everything really does have to do with value added, what the marginal changes are prospectively. And as a result, it breaks the notion of monotonic relations between high test scores, probability of admissions, which are the default retrospective notion, but they in fact do not have these justifications in terms of objectives of institutions. And notice, it isn't even, if you even took what looked like the most SAT-driven one, so to speak, which is pushing the scientific frontier, again, that isn't the right question. The question is, if I have a group of students, how do I identify the ones that have the highest probabilities of pushing the scientific frontier? The SAT can speak to that, but that does not imply monotonicity because there are other sources of information. I know monotonicity sounds like a very nerdy word, but that is really what is being debated when people object to the way that the SAT is being used in many contexts. Second comment, once we think about these objectives, they are fundamentally dynamic. In other words, the college admissions of today are the role models of tomorrow. The college admissions today are the transmissions of information to different communities about what college represents, so on and so forth. And so in other words, once we go down the route of thinking about our objectives, it could be human capital formation, it could be opening the opportunities, all of them, because they are intrinsically objective, they are intrinsically dynamic, once again break this one-to-one relationship in terms of the probabilities. And that becomes fundamental to thinking what it is that happens when you create an entering class. The third point is that they are fundamentally social. Education is a social activity. And so when Steve mentioned the issue of how to think about what it means to have a discussion of American history, Jim Crow and slavery, in which there's no African American participants, that is desiccating the educational experience for everybody involved. And so arguments about diversity and its benefits, I think sometimes they're pretty imprecise because they're treated as it applies to every domain or no domain. If you're asking about the solving of geometry problems, you have a different answer than if you're trying to understand American history. But the point remains, and that is a social activity, which is education, is naturally linked to the interactions you have with other students. And so one cannot assess the contribution of one student to the institution's goals without assessing the entire portfolio, as it were, of the student body. And so when you put those all together, you can have a much more complicated and subtle view of the way the tests work. And in particular, you may have different admissions rules, different sensitivity to tests for graduate school than it would be for undergraduate, so on and so forth. Final thing I want to say is that in some ways I think that the concern on tests and whether they should be optional and using them are missing fundamental questions that are maybe more important. First of all, I'll give it a more narrow one. It's one thing to say that test scores are creating opportunities for elite institutions, et cetera. Another question is, what should be the composition of elite institutions? In other words, elite institutions, as was pointed out, they're bottlenecks. In other words, once you're entered, it's hard to get into, and opportunities and great things happen once you're through. We can ask the question of how to open up the bottlenecks. There is no law of physics that sets the admissions, that sets the entering classes of the University of Chicago or the other elite institutions. And so one can ask the questions about expanding them. And so this was my, my nasty line in front of a provost, of course, is to say, it may be what we need are more UC Berkeley's than University of Chicago's in terms of thinking about these types of objectives. But the serious point, of course, is that is, again, the ecology question. What should be the sets of institutions and how do you open up the bottlenecks? And the second thing is I have to say, I think that the focus on the test scores as they've happened, there's something sad about it because it is ignoring the fundamental question of why are the test scores controversial and what is going on today. And this is the issue of black-white representation at universities. In other words, there are long-standing gaps in test scores across ages. In other words, the gaps that you see in the SAT, you see them in the LSAT, you see them in high school attendance, high school grading, and you see them earlier on. And so I think that the focus on what to do with test scores in terms of should you have them or not, it's actually a very sad thing because the real problem, the deeper problem of the United States is how do we ameliorate the test score gaps? And I think the answer there is, of course, very difficult, but we do have evidence on that. And so I really want to make 3 points. One, I think it's a bad idea to privilege equality over flourishing. In other words, it's one thing to say that I'd equalize probabilities of getting into college. I think it's a much more powerful moral argument to say that we want to maximize everybody achieving their potentials and therefore focus on how do we end these inhibitions so that the test score gaps are perpetuating themselves and somehow reduce them. That's comment number one. Comment two, we do have evidence that intense interventions, combinations of Head Start and substantial changes in pupil expenditures, those can substantially ameliorate test score gaps. So it's not that we know nothing about it, it's that it's costly. And that's one of the damning indictments of a world in which there's a presumption that all taxes are bad things. In fact, they have extremely high rates of return potentially. And the third thing I have to end, kind of I always say this in every talk, the memberships theory, and that is the integration of neighborhoods and schools. That is fundamental to breaking these test score gaps, and that has to be on the table as a policy. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I want to give Nick Leman a chance to respond a little bit to the panel, and I can.
Yeah, should I go up to the podium?
It's okay. You can
Okay.
stay here.
So just a few things. So what is the SAT? What does it measure? And ACT, but let's just stick with the SAT for a minute, because I'm going to say something that sort of sounds surprisingly narrow given the breadth of the discussion. So the SAT is validated in, psychometric terms against first-year grades in college. That's the standard way of validating it. So, in other words, SAT usually predicts somewhere between 20 and 25% of the variance in a student's first-year grades. Its predictive validity falls off after the first year. What it is telling colleges is how likely it is someone will perform at a high level academically in their first year in college. Now, a testing enthusiast would say, this is a miracle. You give me 3 hours of a person's time, and you can learn that much of the variance in the first year grades. But it's also important that, number one, it's a pretty narrow frame, that much predictive power over first year grades, and it does fall off later. Secondly, I want to skip to something else because I'm trying to go really fast. Yes, it's true. The SAT is a workaround against the fact that we don't have a national curriculum. In this discussion, you hear often, if we solve this problem over here, we won't have the testing problem. So if we solve the neighborhood integration problem, we won't have the testing problem. If we solve the national curriculum problem, we won't have the testing problem. Most developed countries have a national curriculum achievement test, which is a much better sort of signaling device. But we don't have that, so we're sort of stuck with the SAT, which is an IQ descended test by direct intention of James B. Conant. That's what he wanted to find because we don't have a national curriculum. It makes people very uncomfortable, but it is an IQ descended test. In terms of meritocracy, Michael Young, aforementioned, wrote a really weird but very prescient book in 1958 called The Rise of the Meritocracy. Point of the book, meritocracy is a bad idea. He was arguing against meritocracy. It's a little ironic because everybody now treats meritocracy as a positively valenced word. But the book ends with the non-meritocrats massacring the meritocrats, which has a little bit of resonance to what's going on in our country today, for me at least. So one of the interesting things about meritocracy is it's an attempt to engineer a certain kind of leadership class that is not universally respected by the whole country as its leadership class. There's a lot of reasons that could be. That's for many other discussions, I suppose. But I just want to raise a couple of possibilities as to why that is. One, when Conan was sort of laying out his vision for all this, mostly in a series of essays in the Atlantic Monthly in the 40s, his vision is very close to what, has anybody, you've all read, or maybe a lot of you have read The Republic, right? So he's trying to create the American version of the Guardians, basically. So he stipulates a couple things. First of all, he stipulates the people I'm going to pick will be absolutely from every corner of the country without respect to background. And then when they have children, their children will go back to every corner of the country. So it's just a one-generation thing. And second, that they'll be completely selfless people. He proposed in these articles things like a 100% inheritance tax, the abolition of private universities. So the idea is, it's a sort of more like the French Grande École or something. I'm picking people to be selfless public servants for a generation. And one of the problems with the system today, if that's the test, is that it's seen much more, as I said before, as a golden ticket to a very high earning job in the private sector, which you can then pass on to your children. I'll cite, I'm going to stop after saying this, but there's a much cited study by Raj Chetty and his co-authors. Well, just, since you mentioned Rawls, I mean, John Rawls, in the same spirit, in A Theory of Justice, says meritocracy should only exist to the extent that it benefits the entire society, not just the meritocrats. So he's also very much against the reward system. So this recent study that got a lot of press by Raj Chetty and co-authors is really a brief against, it's making a case that people from the 1% are way overrepresented in Ivy Plus universities. It's really a cri de coeur saying, let's abolish legacy preferences, donor preferences, athletic preferences, and that way you'll end this unfair, aristocratic style replication of the 1% or overrepresentation in the elite universities. When you really look at his data, though, and you say, well, Professor Chetty et al., what about the 10%? Then the picture looks very different. In one of his tables, this is on page 87, if anybody wants to go look it up, at Ivy Plus, take a 1500 SAT and go by parental income quintile. You have to go to the 90th percentile to have any income decile, I'm sorry, I said quintile, have more than 1% of the population at the Ivy Plus. It's very, very class skewed toward the upper 10%. At 1400, you have to go to the 70th percentile to get 1% representation, in the Ivy Plus. So for whatever reason, it really is a system where, merit and inheritance converge to a very large extent, and admission and private gain converge to a large extent. The same Chetty study, he makes a big thing of admission gets you a job at Google, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, et cetera. When you have that system where you're picking 16 and 17-year-olds with a very heavy weighting of parental background, they're still living at home with their parents, and giving them the ability to be very high earners, and not asking that much of them in return, I think it's natural that the system and the group will be resented. And I think the unpopularity of affirmative action, which I admit, is a subset of the unpopularity of the meritocracy by people who aren't anointed by it. So now you have this weird system where, every preference under the sun is legal except racial preferences. There are many, many other preferences. People are uncomfortable. There is no university that says, to hell with it, we're just going to admit by test score, end of story. So that makes everybody a little uncomfortable. So now you have race only as the unallowed corrective on a pure test score admit. Oh, fun fact, one other thing that came up in the discussion. Who was one of Stanley Kaplan's first SAT 2Ts? Senator Schumer.
So we've been talking a lot about the SATs because that's the test that's used in college admissions, but everybody here is in a graduate school. This is the Harris School is a graduate school, professional school, and you yourself were the dean of a graduate school of journalism. So I wonder if you could say a few words about what you think about the role of testing in admissions to graduate schools. And I know when you were brought in as dean of the graduate school, there was a big debate about what the goal of a journalism graduate school should be, a little bit to Lesley's question about the goal of the university. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, starting with, do you use tests there?
No, we don't. We are, the test that we require is TOEFL, which is English language test, but we are GRE optional, and I would say 5% at most of our students submit a test score. If that, almost nobody ever does. So what we do, now we're small, really small, and the faculty read the folders, we do the admission ourselves, but we do what I think everybody should do, which is authentic assessment, as it's called. So I read a portfolio of the person's essays, their person's work samples, there's a journalist recommendations, there's a grade transcript in there, and that's how I evaluate potential admittees. However, you're right in saying that this debate rages around undergraduate education, and it doesn't really rage that much around graduate education. I don't know of any law schools, for example, that are test optional.
I think the LSAT is required by the ABA.
Yeah, you know, as a society wrestling with these issues, we're decided to wrestle at the undergraduate level more than at the graduate school level. I understand some of the reasons for that, but you're right in pointing out that there's that difference.
I wonder if you wanted to say something about Professor Raudenbush's argument that we need a test, some type of test. That test optional is not a good idea, even if.
Well, you know, the people at the University of California, and you know, I'm a reporter, so you're supposed to, you know, when I was growing up in newsrooms, there'd always be some old guy who'd say, "If your mom says she loves you, check it out." So the official word from the University of California system is it's been a huge success, going to a no-test system where you can't submit. It's hugely increased their minority applications and minority presence, they say, while keeping graduation rates and academic standards high. I have not gone and independently investigated that, but they have a whole story that they tell. I would prefer, like you, an achievement test system. And you know, that's what Rick Atkinson in an earlier UC fight 25 years ago tried to do, is change out the SAT for what was then called the SAT-2, a series of achievement tests that no longer exist. To make that truly fair, you have to have much more equalization of the quality of our 13,000 public school districts in the United States. There's no perfect solution here. Everything has costs and benefits. But I think one of the good things about it is, so how many people here have forgotten their SAT score? Okay. That's more than I usually get. So, you know, most people, for most Americans, something like 2 million people a year take the SAT. Very few of those people, you know, proportionally, have it serve as a way to get them to a highly selective college. Most of them are taking it for a whole bunch of other reasons. But I think and there's this sort of mystification, it's a test of how smart you are. No, it's a test of whether you took test prep. et cetera. It would just be a lot clearer signal to say, we've got a national curriculum, you want a high score, study in school. And then it's a healthier system for the people who don't get high scores. And, you know, per some of the stats I was just citing, there really aren't that many people who come from very disadvantaged backgrounds and get very high SAT scores, and that's how the system finds them. I used to be able to get those numbers from the College Board years ago. Now they don't give them anymore, but I think it's going to be a quite small number, and you know, that should be part of the understanding of that discussion, is that it doesn't upend the class system every generation, like Conant and other enthusiasts said it would.
So before we open it up to question and answer from the audience, which I know there'll be lots of questions, I would love to invite the panel for any responses they might want to give us to what we've just heard.
I don't have a response per se, but I wanted to circle back to, and I think the very last chapter of your book actually speaks to this. We focus so much on Ivy Plus, or even sort of the schools that are somewhat selective, but something like 94% of students are going to community colleges, which are open access regional four-year institutions, or just marginally selective institutions. I think the sort of importance of Ivy Plus for a pipeline to the halls of power can't be understated. But if we're thinking about large changes in income, economic mobility, we have to think about policies that affect students in these non-selective institutions. And I think very briefly, we have evidence of policies that work. They cost money. Right? It's not a matter of changing who's admitted. It's a matter of spending more on what are quite under-resourced institutions. So that is a little bit off topic, but I think it speaks to one of the conclusions of your book, that we can't just focus on these schools like University of Chicago, even though we're all sitting here at these schools. But we have to think about, as Stephen mentioned, the broader ecosystem.
Just to add a quick comment, a book that many of you will know on the panel at least that I really recommend is by Bill Bowen and co-authors, called Crossing the Finish Line. It focuses on, I mean, most people at a place like this don't know that, you know, only something like 60% of people who start college get a degree, even though there's a really demonstrable payoff to a degree. And under half of people who enter community college, which is the only majority-minority part of higher ed, don't finish, even though there's a payoff. So in that book is where they have these statistics that the predictive validity for graduation and other four-year performance or six-year performance metrics of the SAT falls off. So they're sort of de-emphasizers. But nonetheless, it's weird to me, you know, we just had this big presidential election, everything was on the table. Nobody ever talks about that issue. You know, it's upsetting.
I mean, I think part of the problem is the people in the conversation went to these Ivy Plus institutions, and so that looms large, and it occupies a greater share of our attention than the actual set of students who are potentially going to college.
Just an interesting point I was noticing, doing some reading, that at least a while ago, and I don't know what the results are now, that even though a lot of institutions, most institutions are not selective, a very large number of them do require the SAT or the ACT. So that's an interesting question. If it's not that useful, why are they requiring it? Maybe it's because of U.S. News and World Report or something else. I don't know why it is, but they seem to think that their prestige is tied up with it in some way.
So I can answer that quickly, is that the zoom upward in SAT takers was way before U.S. News started ranking college.
Okay.
And I think the basic reason, I mean, there's a couple of reasons, but one reason is the desire to be associated with the highly selective schools.
Right, right.
You know, it's aspirational.
Right.
Another is that much of the faculty at the less selective schools are graduates of the highly selective schools. And you know, that sort of adds to the sociological oomph. But the ratings enforce it or enhance it, but it precedes the ratings. The numbers went like 45 to 65. From 1945 to 1965 was the big to where it got over 2 million. And it's been pretty steady since then.
So we might think it's dysfunctional, but we have to convince those people not to require it.
I'll just make one additional comment, and that is in thinking about test scores, they are a consequence of student choices, and the admissions rules that are set determine those choices. So in other words, policies that eliminate affirmative action create this monotonic relationship between test scores and college admissions. They create disincentives for many people, because if you go to a weaker high school, you're behind, so to speak, and if the colleges are not going to adjust the assessment of the SAT, for example, in response to that, that would kill the incentives to invest and try to work harder. And so, again, I think one wants to step back and ask the question, how do we maximize the, like I said before, the flourishing, the potential of individuals being fulfilled? That's a different question. And so you want to structure the incentives that students that face, the opportunities that they have in such a way to push them along those trajectories. And so I think that there's actually some interesting evidence of that. Zachary Bleemer at Princeton, who studied the effects of the end of affirmative action in California, found, roughly speaking, what you had was discouragement. With no benefit. And so in that sense, it was just an unambiguous loss. And so I think that should also be part of the conversation.
Yeah. All right, well, I'd love to open it up for question and answer to anybody. You can ask questions of anybody on the panel. I will note that when Professor Leman asked who had forgotten their SAT scores, none of us raised their hands, so I'm going to put off limits asking us what our SAT scores were, but anything else is open for questions.
Hello, thank you for the great panel. It was suggested that SAT scores are biased in favor of the rich because, for among other reasons, they can afford tutoring more than the poor can. Though it seems the remaining information would also be biased. Presumably, you can also pay for tutors for high school classes to improve your grades. If you know the director of a fancy program, you can get your kid into that, and that will look good on their resume. Is there evidence that the remaining information is less biased than SAT scores? And if not, why think that removing SAT scores would help remove bias?
I can start with, the one that is, be careful about how you use the word bias. In a sense, you can say the SAT, as I said before, the SAT is designed to predict first-year GPA. So the reason the class transmission part of the SAT and its predictability are very related to each other. They're not opposite forces, they're working together, right? Like, I'm a privileged person. My kids were not just test prep, but like every obsessive, books are all over the house, obsessed with education and enrichment. And that makes them, quote, more qualified for college, too. So you can be privileged and more qualified. That's what makes this sort of super problematic. People have looked for years, like alchemists used to look for the universal solvent, and explorers used to look for the Northwest Passage. So people have looked for the, class-neutral SAT, race-neutral, gender-neutral. It's really hard to find, partly because if you can make the scores the same across class, you lose predictive validity. It's very tough to get there, and people have tried.
I think an easier question is, like, for a given goal, do we do better if we have the SAT versus not? And there was a expert witness for the Supreme Court case on behalf of University of North Carolina, Carolyn Hoxby, who had access to huge amount of information all the way from kindergarten to college, so more information than most colleges have. And even with all of this information and family background and grades and what school you went to and what your test scores were in 3rd grade, there still was like predictive power of the SAT. That doesn't mean first-year grades is what schools should be choosing students based on, and I would guess that that actually is not what they're choosing students based on, but it does have additional information content. And the question is sort of relative to not having it, are schools better able to choose a cohort of students that is the best for them, to Stephen's point about institutional objectives?
And then the other mega question is, how valuable is the transcript? Because, you know, the transcript wipes out class a lot, because everybody's applying to U of C gets all A's pretty much, right? But the testing enthusiasts say, well, that's grade inflation, so the transcript doesn't tell you anything. And there's a hot debate that you all know about, is the transcript trustworthy or not trustworthy? But at this moment in 2025, the big argument for the SAT is the transcript doesn't tell you what you really want to know, and so you need the SAT also.
May I say, though, that if you look at Chicago public school data following kids into college, the grades swamp test scores in their predictive validity. Of course, part of this is because we're not talking about the highly selective schools where all the applicants have very high grades. We're talking about a group of people where there's huge variation in grades. And what the grades actually represent is a set, not just some cognitive skills, but a set of motivational aspects. People who show up, get the work done, and are reliably doing what they're supposed to do in high school tend to do better in college. And that turns out to be very, very important for this citywide prediction of how well kids are going to do.
All right, let's go to the question back there.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. My question is actually related to grade inflation as well. So you've mentioned that SATs are a predictor of only a first-year GPA, really. I think, so, and you just started talking about high school transcript, grade inflation. The grade level inflation problem exists also at every elite university at this point. And like, I went to an undergrad institution that had grade deflation and then chose to get rid of it because it was having a trouble like attracting students. I mean, UChicago, we say like, this is where fun goes to die, but also I think it's really remarkably hard to fail at Harris. So I'm just kind of, I guess, curious about that, like SAT as a predictor, anything as a predictor of GPA. And then secondarily, curious about, because I've heard some people say that there is a correlation between when affirmative action started and when grade inflation started. So two-part question.
You know, grade inflation has been around a long time. I have not seen really good data that says on this day it started, and before that you could really track school transcript. Conant back in the early 1930s was making the grade inflation argument. So do you all know of data showing that a moment came either in higher ed or K through 12 when grade inflation sort of kicked in and made the transcript unreliable?
After I graduated. So the answer is I'm not aware of studies like that. I also don't know, at least for colleges, whether some of this has to do with the composition of majors. In other words, some department, mathematics has a different distribution than another one. And if the composition of the courses people take changes over time, that would have induced it with no actual change in the policy per se.
Going back to your question about Columbia Journalism School, which I know is like a real outlier, we don't have grades at all. And the reason we don't have grades is no employer ever says to a journalist, I want to see your transcript. They say, I want to see your work samples. It's like running a drama school or something like that. So it's kind of authentic assessment all the way down, because the students are actually very competitive, and the job market is very selective right now, but it's based on the actual journalistic work that they can show to employers, which socially I think is more attractive than transcripts.
Well, we have time for one more question. Yeah. Sorry.
Can you wait for a mic to come so we can hear?
Anyway, I should say thank you for all of your contributions. But since the Chetty article was referenced, when I looked at that article, what struck me was the opposite of what they emphasize. For 99.5% of the distribution, income had no effect. Test score, whatever your test score was, you had the same probability of getting admitted regardless of your income. And this goes to Stephen's point about why haven't people responded to that? That the test score, it is a meritocracy based on the test score. And why don't lower income people and high schools just teach to the test, do everything to the test, and respond to that very strong fact?
So pull up the study, and again, look at the chart on page 87, okay? So yes, he has devastating evidence that being in the top 1% in parental income kind of gives you a special extra chance, and you get admitted at a much higher rate than your academic credentials would indicate. So he's on a campaign to get rid of the things that give the 1% their preferences, right? But two things. One, he still presents a picture that advantages the top 10% because their academic credentials are much higher, much, much higher than the other 90% of the society. That's just true by his data and other data. And then why do they persist? You know, I think it's basically because these are, unlike Conant's prediction was that private universities would fade away, but instead they have stayed around, and the public universities have become more privatized in the sense of having development offices and so on. And there are things about keeping the machine running that make it very hard to get rid of things like athletic preferences and alumni preferences. Amherst College, 40% of the students are varsity athletes. Princeton undergrad, 25% of the students are varsity athletes. Chetty admits, this is per a couple of things I've said before, that legacy applicants are more qualified academically by his measures than non-legacy applicants. So, you know, there is, whenever something horrible is taking place, there's always some reason for it, and there are reasons for leaderships of institutions not to say, all right, that's it, no more athletes, no more, you know, alumni kids, et cetera.
Well, I think we are at our time, so I wanted to invite you to join me in thanking Nick Leman and the panel. And thank you all for coming again. Thanks.